Wikileaks founder Julian Assange leaving London for a U.S. courtroom in the Northern Mariana Islands, where he is expected to plead guilty to conspiring to steal and distribute classified documents on U.S. wars and foreign policy. In a video recorded on June 19th, Assange's associate suggests the deal to free him came together in recent days.
I just came out of Belmarsh prison in what I hope is my last visit to see Julian here in this prison where he's spent 5 years, 2 months, and 2 weeks.
The U.S. Justice Department says that between 2009 and 2011, Assange plotted with military intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning to steal and then publish more than 700,000 pages of classified documents discussing the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. diplomats' emails, and other sensitive material. Assange said he was practicing journalism, but took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London to avoid arrest. Still, the U.S. charged him in 2019 with violating the Espionage Act. Assange spent 5 years in a British prison fighting extradition. Earlier this year, the leaders of the U.S. and Australia suggested they wanted to resolve the matter once and for all. Despite the pending guilty plea, Assange's supporters still call him a hero.
Throughout the years of Julian's imprisonment and persecution, an incredible movement has been formed. A movement of people from all walks of life, from around the world, who support not just Julian, and not just us and our family, but what Julian stands for, truth and justice.
It's not clear what Julian Assange will do when he returns to Australia, or what restrictions his homeland will place on him in turn. Rosiland, Jordan, Al Jazeera.
Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author, and he was part of the Bring Julian Assange Home campaign. He's joining us live from Sydney. Good to see you as always, Antony. Your reaction to this development as someone who has campaigned for Assange's release?
It's huge, it's momentous, it's surprising in a way. Obviously, we've heard hints in the last months that maybe there was a deal on the table, that maybe Assange and the US and Australia would somehow find a way to get him out. But it's important that he is, because the idea that he was in prison in the first place, in England's most high security prison for practicing journalism, was always an outrage for him, but also for journalism in general. As the Wikileaks statement just said, you just read out, it really goes to the heart of what many of us who haven't written about Wikileaks since 2006, when the organisation founded. And there's really no news organisation in my adult life in the 21st century that has produced more important documents about pretty much how power works, from the US to Russia to the CIA to Iraq to Afghanistan. The list goes on and on and on. And any serious journalist, any citizen can look at those documents anytime. Wikileaks has it on their website. So it's an important, momentous day for him, but also for journalism as well.
And Antony, you say, and certainly many associations working for journalists' rights say, that he has been in prison for being a journalist. So why has Assange pleaded guilty to a single criminal count, but a count nonetheless, of conspiring to obtain and disclose classified US national defense documents?
I mean, it's frankly absurd that he had to get his freedom. Obviously, I can't speak for him. I can't speak for his legal team. They can, I guess, speak for themselves in the days and weeks ahead. But the idea that the US required him to admit that, let's be clear, what Julian Assange was doing about 15 or so years ago was journalism. Investigative journalism is finding sources, which was Chelsea Manning back in the day, to get information about Iraq or Afghanistan. So if Julian Assange can be put in jail potentially forever, which was what he was facing, for practicing investigative journalist, finding sources, talking to journalists, getting information from sources, then all of us are at threat. And it's ridiculous, frankly, that the White House demanded him to plead guilty to that to get his freedom. But it makes perfect sense from his position that he would do that, because understandably he wants to see his family and have freedom after years and years of incarceration.
And what do you think has led to his release? The indictment was made when Donald Trump was president, and we know that, there's a US presidential election coming up that could see Donald Trump returning to power.
Look, in many ways, this was becoming a problem for the Biden administration because the people who supported his ongoing incarceration was essentially shrinking by the day. There was, in Australia where I am, there was bipartisan support in both major sides of politics to have him released. Public opinion in Australia for years has supported his release. In many parts of the US, across the left and the right, from Tucker Carlson to those on the left, they've been calling for years for his release. So ultimately, I think Biden saw it as an inconvenience. And the idea that during an election year, you would have potentially Julian Assange in a US court having to defend himself for doing journalism was just, I guess something in the end they just didn't want to have to face. So they found a way to get him out.
Yeah, and you mentioned Chelsea Manning, who was, of course, pardoned by the Obama administration. You touched on this briefly, Antony, but how much of a victory is this for press freedom? What impact did his years of having to be holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid extradition and then 5 years of solitary confinement in a maximum security prison have on journalism?
It's a victory, to be sure. The only caveat to that, of course, is the idea that the US required him to admit something that all of us as journalists or good journalists do, which is finding sources. And that, I think, will still put a chill over some national security journalists in the US and elsewhere, that the idea that they could potentially be charged. I mean, let's be clear. Julian Assange is not an American citizen. He hasn't spent much time in America. He's an Australian citizen. The idea that he could potentially be put on espionage charges in the US for practicing journalism remains a threat, despite the fact that he's been released. But there's no doubt that this, I think, shows clearly that in the end, through years and years of public campaigns, civil society actions, political pressure, in the end, in a time of deep, deep depressive news from Gaza to Sudan, there's a ray of light that Julian is coming back to Australia, finally.
Antony Loewenstein joining us live from Sydney there. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.